A great pleasure to chair this presentation on the topic of between imagination and constraint, identity and persona as play in elements in democracy. And presenting for us tonight is none other. I guess I could say it's the real Alfred Moore. Despite the persona gymnastics that he might be capable of. And Alfred is currently a senior lecturer at the Department of Politics at the University of York. He has an impressively broad corpus of work for someone of his stage of career. He's written a book on critical elitism, deliberation, democracy, and politics of expertise with Cambridge University Press. He's written widely on the politics of expertise, and his work engages with a wide range of themes in contemporary democratic theory, including anonymity and deliberation in democratic non-participation. In 2020-2021, he held a British Academy Mid-Career Fellowship for the project Rethinking Political Competition. And he is currently researching the role of ideas of competition in democratic theory and practice. So it's a great pleasure to have you here, Alfred. Before we proceed, a couple of formalities. The first is, as is our tradition, I'd like to acknowledge that those of us in Canberra, at least, are on Ngunnawal land that has been never been ceded, and we and I pay our respects to elders past, present, and future. And in addition, just to let you all know that this meeting is being recorded, and it will also be uploaded on our YouTube channel subsequent to the presentation. Okay, well, with that further ado, we'll hand over to Alfred for 30 minutes, and then we'll proceed to questions.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Simon, for that kind introduction, and thank you, Hans, for the invitation, and thank you, Ferd, for doing all the setting up of this event. It's really great to be virtually joining you. What I am going to talk about, as I said, is identity and persona as play elements in democracy. So I'll kick off by just giving you a bit of background to where I'm coming from in this, or where we're coming from, I should say. I should have acknowledged right up the front that, you know, this is part of a book project, and it's a project that I'm working on with Michael Mackenzie, who's now at Vancouver Island University in Canada. And we've been working on this project. It kind of came out of the Competition and Democracy project, but it kind of came out through a side door, as it were, because we were both reading Homo Ludens. I'd been reading Homo Ludens, and I suggested it to Michael. And we thought it was fascinating, and we thought it was incredibly productive for thinking about democracy. And so Heisinger's book Homo Ludens from the 1930s here is, you know, sort of a classic, but also not one that's picked up very much in political theory. But he talks about play, and he talks about man as player, as this fundamental characteristic of what it is to be human. And he defined play as a voluntary activity or occupation executed within certain fixed limits of time and place, according to the rules that are freely accepted but absolutely binding, having its aim in itself and accompanied by a feeling of tension, joy, and the consciousness that it is different from ordinary life. So for Heisinger, play is something pretty fundamental to what it is to be human. And it includes games, but it's not restricted to them. And we prefer the terminology. We use the language of games and play, but we use both. We take play to be a more general category. And Heisinger describes, you know, what we would call competitive games or games of chance, but he also talks of play in the more theatrical sense. And it's certainly this more theatrical sense that I focus on today. I point to another couple of books, The Grasshopper, a philosophy book from the 1970s, and then another philosopher, Si-Tai Nguyen, writing just a couple of years ago on games, art, and agency. They've picked up the theme of games and play, and particularly these later philosophers focus on games. Understood, and they sort of understand games as something of a side activity in social life. You know, there's something that you do in your free time. And both each of these thinkers think of them as, like Heisinger, something that's absolutely fundamental to what it is to be human, but they think of it as a socially side activity, a kind of marginal activity. So Nguyen, for example, takes the pickup football game as the absolute like epitome of game playing, precisely because it's unconnected to the world outside. Like you don't make money, results don't matter from one game to the next. It's all of this, it's as sealed up as it can be as a separate space in which we exercise our capacities. But we take the view that that's an extreme case, and that in fact most play is embedded in and clearly connected to the life around it. And we think particularly of democratic politics, right? So it's not a side activity. Parliament, unlike a football game, has a clear connection to the structure of society, but it is set apart from ordinary life, and its manners of speech are protected by special privileges, guided by ritual and rules. And so one of the very few political theorists who has picked up Homo ludens was Michael Oakeshott, who, and we don't share his sort of conservative sympathies, right? But he picks up Heisinger and reads that directly into parliamentary politics, where he says, friends appear as opponents, there is dispute without hatred, conflict without violence, victory is subordinated to accepted rules and conventions. The whole is enveloped in a convention which allows victory by words and no other manner. And so for Oakeshott, he picks up Heisinger. He doesn't talk about him at great length, but it's for a key to the way in which politics, democratic politics, turns conflict into a productive and peaceful exchange. It's like it's part of the story of how democracy tames conflict. So so we sort of pick up more of that sense of the centrality of play in democratic life. So I should just tell a story. Last year, Michael was out to dinner with a former professional wrestler. I was like, this is just to give a little bit of motivation for our project. You know, he was out to dinner with this former professional wrestler, and he was talking to him about this project that we were working on. And the wrestler was like immediately grabbed by the idea that democracy is a game. And he immediately saw parallels with his professional life, but he was deeply cynical about democratic politics. And so he's this kind of figure who kind of, you know, he cares about issues of common concern and the need for joint action, but he's completely disengaged from formal democratic politics and utterly cynical about it. And so what we sort of want to say in this book, in this project, is like, you're right to think that democracy is a game, but you're wrong to be cynical about it. Or your cynicism, it shouldn't be blanket cynicism. We need to be more careful in what we worry about and what we don't worry about when we look at these play elements in democracy. Sorry, that was a very so that's a little background to the project. And like the book outline, as you can see here, like we talk about concepts of play, we talk about different modes of fair play, and we talk about different forms of foul play, what's outside, what's the deception, violence, and so on. And this part comes from where we talk about what we call realms of play. But in these later sections, one thing we're going to be talking about is protest and power. But here we're talking about performance and pretending. And an illustration from UK politics, I hope you're lucky enough not to be familiar with this figure. He's Boris Johnson, the former UK Prime Minister. And he's not only a notorious sort of liar, but also a kind of artful constructor of a political persona. So there was a story about him told by a journalist who had accompanied him to give a speech at an event. And he gave this talk about Boris Johnson coming in 5 minutes before, acting like he didn't know where he was, doing this entire sort of routine of looking around on the stage and like realizing, and then, you know, making this great comedic sort of performance. But it was, and then he he told the story about then meeting him 6 months later and having at another speech event and finding the exact same performance again, the exact same thing. And what this gives is a sort of an air of falseness, and a sense in which, you know, he's putting on an act. And he was widely sort of criticized for this, and people have tried to attack him for this. They point out that his real name is Alexander, that Boris is sort of a stage name, you know, that people, his family at home call him Alexander. And to give an idea of some of this criticism, so Rory Stewart, who is another Conservative, or was another Conservative MP, probably put this most eloquently. He described Johnson as a sort of symptom of a sickening political culture. He said, our culture remains trapped by the idea that politics is a game. We pretend, so this is a quote from in his article in the Financial Times, we pretend the politician can wear a deceitful mask before the voters and then take it off in the cabinet room, but the mask is infected with a virus which corrodes their minds, souls, and capacity to govern. And what we want to say, just to be clear, is not a defense of Johnson. That's not where we're going here. But what we want to push back, I'll say at the end, I mean, we're sort of sympathetic to a lot of what we think Stewart's concerned about. But the way he does it is to talk of deceitful masks and give the impression that masking is something inherently, an inherent source of falseness in democratic politics, that there's something inherently wrong with it. But we want to say that pretense is not the same as deception. Like, pretending is a form of play. And forms of play, as we understand them, are underpinned by common knowledge. As in, pretending is consistent with all participants knowing you're pretending. And lying is not. And deception is not. So it's not the same. That masking and deceit are not quite the same thing, though you can use your mask for deceit. And I think the way that Stewart talks kind of sets up a sort of serious politics over here, and then this politics of performance and persona over there, and paints it as something that's tightly bound to the things that we really do and rightly worry about in democratic politics, like deception. But what we want to argue is that pretending is, in some ways, essential to democratic practice, and that this focus on the real Boris behind the mask, as it were, distracts from the central question of actually what makes for good democratic performance. So I'm going to briefly sketch 4 ways in which pretending is, we think, essential to democratic practice. One of them is pretending equality. One is pretending in the common good, pretending in representation, pretending and deliberation. So to start with pretending equality, this is one of those areas where democratic politics, particularly sort of the formal parliamentary, you know, the sort of the empowered sphere, you might say, the formal part of liberal democracy looks like a sham. Right? It looks false. It looks like these classic equalities, equal voting rights, the equal opportunity to run for office, next to the deep inequalities that run through modern societies. This looks like a sham. But we think we're better off understanding that gap between ideal and practice in terms of pretense. And we think about 2 ways of pretending equality, or 2 senses in which we pretend equality. One is that democracy creates spaces of pretend equality where real decisions can be made. And so the idea here is that the sort of, if you think of democracy as a competitive game, it contains a kind of implicit demand for equality, like, because the purpose is for players to confront each other under ideal conditions of equality and to exclude or control for variables or factors that aren't really thought to be relevant to the gameplay, to what the gameplay is meant to test and what are deemed relevant for winning. And democratic contests are best when players are equal in the qualities that are thought to be irrelevant to the contest, like how much money they've got. But they're supposed to be unequal or competitive regarding relevant qualities, such as their persuasiveness or their popular support. And the sort of value for conducting contests in this way is that the results are taken to prove the winner's superiority in ways that are beyond dispute by the losers. There's a sense in which that democracy sets up these spaces. Real decisions are made, but because there's something in the setup of equality, the setup that demands that there's a sort of implicit pull towards equality within them, even though that's not cashed out, right? And I think this second point, in a way, you could sort of see this as an elaboration, because Iris Young makes a point that's a little like the one that we just make there. But we could also argue that pretending equality can help realize equality. And in a way, that's the way we sort of think this is a more productive way to think about that gap between the manifest, the formal equalities and the manifest inequalities. I mean, Hobbes, for a classic, expression, like he thought pretending equality was essential to maintaining political society, right? He thought that we're all made unequal, but we all tend to believe that we're better than others. And what grounds equality in political society is the recognition that we're all equally unable to persuade others of our superiority. And what this means is that a kind of important element of political equality is built on a sort of mutual pretense. People who hold others in contempt are compelled to act as if they respected them. And without this, we'd have a politics of raw power. But we can go further and say, again, with Iris Young, that ritual expressions of respect, such as greeting, which, however pretended they are, or however kind of pro forma, as she puts it, they contain within them a promise of inclusion that at least has the potential to bring about more effective inclusion in decision processes. And so she's putting this in a sort of much more sort of micro-sociological kind of way, but we think this is a way in which setting up these spaces of formal equality can bring with it an implicit expectation of equality that can in turn work back through the process. And again, Young is, of course, also under no illusions that this performs some kind of magic and makes inequality disappear, but it does give people a kind of, she says, people struggling, the less powerful who are struggling for recognition within this process, it gives them something to latch onto, right? It gives them a claim, like it gives them a promise of inclusion, she puts it. And you kind of, and our point, I suppose, where we think back to our wrestler or something, we think back to this guy who's looking at politics with great cynicism. We sort of say, look, this kind of pretending does give an air of falseness to a lot of political interaction. You can see when the members of the UK House of Commons, for instance, all follow that convention of talking about the honourable member for Mid Bedfordshire when they think the member for Mid Bedfordshire is a crook. It all sounds a bit ridiculous. But politics without that kind of everyday pretense exemplified by rituals of greeting, you have something that looks like Trump, who like openly insults and mocks his opponents and sort of gleefully refuses to pretend to respect his opponents. And so we think this is an aspect of, refusing to pretend to respect his opponents, refusing to pretend to be equal. Trump refuses to play the democratic game. Our second point is about pretending in the common good. I give a quote here from Mitt Romney, running for office in 2012 in the US, where he said, "I am not concerned about the very poor." And this caused a bit of a blow up and a bit of a fuss. And he attempted to clarify and so on and so on. But it seemed like a shocking remark. And it seemed like a shocking remark, we think, because it's quite rare to see a politician sort of so blatantly disregard others. And so the point is, like, we don't expect our politicians to be genuinely other regarding all the time. And that would probably be too much to expect from them or of ourselves. But at minimum, we would expect them to at least pretend to care about others. And in this case, Romney kind of made an acting error, like he failed to pretend to care about the poor. But this sort of thing, okay, he gives an example, he gives us an example of a failure of this kind of pretense. And it often looks very bad. But as John Elster famously argued, there can be a kind of civilizing force in this hypocrisy. I mean, we put his argument about the civilizing force of hypocrisy in slightly different terms. But we might see deliberators as actors engaged in a performance where they're incentivized in a deliberative forum to play the role of their better selves. And they must think about their own interests in relation to the interests of others and dress up their arguments in forms that are appropriate for that. And if they can make plausible arguments that are in some respects aligned with the interests of others, then those collective decisions that come out of the process might better reflect the complex and conflicting interests of everyone involved. And I suppose this will probably be a very familiar argument to a lot of you, but it's an element, but it shows to us a kind of, again, a kind of centrality of this practice of pretense and of a kind of a play practice at the heart of what makes democracy work when it works. So, it's as we put it, although it's difficult to know what the public interest is, it's better for everyone when those in power feel they have to act as if they are public spirited, because then those decisions will have to be explained and justified in public regarding terms. So I realize I've got about 10 minutes left, so I'll talk about, so this third element is pretending and representation. Again, this is another way in which we get a source of a lot of the kind of activity that makes politics look false. So politicians not just pretending to care about others who they maybe don't actually care about, but politicians pretending to be like others, pretending to share the tastes of the people they claim to represent. So, I mean, there are many examples of these kinds of performances, but the UK Prime Minister, this is an available example for me. David Cameron in 2012 forgot which football team he supposedly supported, because of course he's not really a football fan, but he sort of pretended he was and then got his teams mixed up. So it's sort of an attempt to construct a relatable persona that obviously looked ridiculous. But again, we think that such performances, or at least more broadly the construction of persona, this is not for us a story about the importance of being real, as it were. It's a question about how performance can be a valuable part of representation. Because we think effective representatives are going to construct stories, right? They have to construct stories and personas that connect with people and thereby help them connect their own values to shared problems or objectives, or to motivate action. And it's a little like the role that Russell Muirhead and Nancy Rosenblum describe in their book on partisanship, as the sort of partisan connection, as this kind of underappreciated element of the ethos of partisanship, is the capacity of partisan leaders to forge connections with people. And we think that when you follow that through, you see that actually effective representatives are going to find it very hard to avoid doing this kind of thing. Avoid, to some extent, being actors and constructing a persona, right? And good acting in this sense might be required to bring publics together, to get them to act together, to help them understand themselves, and to encourage them to accept collective decisions as legitimate, to encourage them to act for others as well as themselves. And we think that, again, what matters less is that the political persona matches the person, right? The sort of the gap between Boris and Alexander is, we think, not the problem with Boris Johnson. The problem is what he's doing with his persona. So, the problem is not the gap, as it were, but the problem is that, or the question, what matters is whether the persona is congruent with the values and interests that you aim to advance, right? That whether the persona works to articulate a broader set of values and perspectives and interests, or whether it's at odds with them. And we think it's important that it's relatively stable, like whether this persona has sort of sufficient stability to ground practices of communicative accountability. So, simply, it's easier, we think, to sort of flip-flop on policy, almost. It's easier to change direction on policies than it is to change one's persona. But we think that this kind of construction of personas that are relatively congruent and stable are important to the practice of representation. And again, if we might see the value of this in the breach, right, in a sense, in looking at the dangers of the politics of pretending that you're not pretending. So Elizabeth Markovits had a lovely essay in the Journal of Political Philosophy a while back, criticizing what she called the realist political style as, of course, a political style, like the rhetoric of people who pretend they're not doing rhetoric, the pretending of people who say they're not pretending. And I think Rory Stewart falls into this gap a little bit, like the guy I quoted at the beginning. But this kind of realist style involves plain and sometimes technical speech, a sort of pained emphasis on external constraints and second best options and hard choices and trade-offs, but it's still a performance. Right? So again, we want to get away from the view that there's something suspect about performance in democratic representation. The final point then, I think I've got about 5 minutes. Is that right, Simon? Yeah. So it's pretending and deliberation. And there's a lot to say here. We focus on this figure of the devil's advocate, the example of the devil's advocate. The term obviously comes from the Catholic Church. When the church was thinking of making someone a saint, they would hire an advocate to make the case against canonization. And candidates, if you're a candidate for sainthood, you can be presumed already to be good, beyond reproach, and if they were at risk of being given an easy ride. The devil's advocate was there to point out flaws and to test the case. And John Stuart Mill identifies this with the practice of argumentation. And he's quite famously, in the most famous essay, arguing that it's essential to have one's claims challenged by others. We might have good ideas, but we can only really know that they're good ideas once they've been challenged by others and successfully defended, once they've survived a kind of trial of this sort. And in Mill's view, it's best to have genuine opponents to ensure that the reasons that justify our beliefs are kept at the forefront of our mind. But when you can't find a genuine opponent, he thinks it would be necessary to make one. That it's necessary to conjure up the devil's advocate. So essential is this discipline to a real understanding of moral human subjects that if opponents don't exist, we must imagine them, supply them with the strongest arguments which the most skillful devil's advocate can conjure up. And this kind of, and like Mill, we sort of think this is a more general, this tells us something important about public deliberation. But we think this, focusing on this sort of devil's advocate role, we think this kind of the pretending involved in this practice works in three ways. The first is through a kind of separation, right? creating a distance from the self. A devil's advocate is publicly acknowledged to be playing a role. And in this way, it can help separate the person from the arguments being advanced. And so this kind of performance can keep arguments at the level of ideas and help to ensure that arguments are not accepted or rejected simply because of the identity or partisan affiliation or background or reputation of the person advancing them. So there's that kind of ideal at work, this idea that we should separate social status from claims, and that this kind of open pretense is a mechanism for achieving that. The second, which is one that Mill particularly expressed as well, is protection. Right, that pretending offers a kind of protection. This kind of performance creates a sphere of freedom where unpopular or even repugnant ideas can be expressed. They're valuable, famously as he put it, they're valuable to argumentation, in part because without them, we risk holding our beliefs as dead dogma. But for various reasons, people may be reluctant to advance them. And that having this kind of the social protection that's afforded by open pretense can also be a valuable aid to the weighing and testing of arguments for and against a course of action. The third point, which we think is like less obvious in most of the readings, from most of the readings of Mill, is about competition, or it's about competitive motivation. Because Mill thought that someone who pretended to hold the view would be a less effective advocate than a true believer. That's why he thought, ideally, you'd have a genuine opponent. And only if you don't have one, or they're suppressed or frightened or whatever, then it's good to, then you make someone play the role. But we're not quite, we're not so sure that it is the second best in this respect. Because part of the reason the devil's advocate role works to the extent that the sort of the desire to win the debate takes precedence over the substance of the issue. And in a way, this is something that is really, that we often feel like we don't want in deliberation, right? You don't want people wanting to win for its own sake. And you don't want people to simply be sort of point scoring. Yet in this argument that from the devil's advocate, it sort of suggests that this is where it's crucial to have this kind of motivation, because it's a motivation that's centered in the game itself. It's a motivation that's centered within the desire to win rather than to substantively get what one wants. And when it's like, when the substance of the issue is at the forefront of your mind, there will be temptations to bypass the process altogether, or to use deception or other sorts of things. But we think that in fact, the kind of the game-like quality of this role in the discursive contest is actually crucial to a kind of motivation, a motivation to win without deception, a motivation to want to win well, as it were. So it's actually the sort of separation from the more existential stakes, as it were, that can provide something of this value that can. So that's basically where we wanted to do, to sketch out some ways in which pretending and pretense can be central to democratic practice. They're not all of it, right, by any means. And in suggesting the democratic value of forms of pretense, we don't mean to neglect the kind of seriousness, as we might put it, of politics, right? Decisions matter. They're often life and death. These are important matters. But what we want to push back against, to go back to the example I began with, Boris Johnson, and then Rory Stewart's criticism of him for, being a politics that is not serious. What we want to push back against is the distinction that's clearly in Rory Stewart's mind between play and serious. If it's play, it cannot be serious. Whereas our conception of both play and democracy is that they're coupled, and that it's precisely because our conflicts are so serious that it is valuable to construct spaces in which we pretend equality and engage one another through these modes of performance in order to make decisions together that will work back into our lives. So yeah, I'll leave it there and just say thank you very much.